Margaret Eleanor Davis had always believed that kindness was like a seed. You never knew where it might take root or when it would bloom. At 53, she had learned this lesson many times over, but never quite like this. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in October when everything changed. Margaret sat in the small reception area of Henderson Accounting Services, her hands folded carefully in her lap, watching as her 8-year-old son, Tommy, colored quietly in the corner. The autumn light filtered through the tall windows, casting gentle shadows across the waiting room where she had worked as a receptionist for nearly 4 years. Tommy had been sick the night before. Nothing serious, just one of those childhood fevers that comes and goes like a spring storm. But the school nurse had called, and Margaret's usual babysitter was visiting her own grandchildren in Phoenix. In moments like these, a single mother learns to make difficult choices. She had called her supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, that morning. Her voice had been steady, professional, as she explained the situation. "I understand it's not ideal," Margaret had said, "but Tommy is quiet, and he'll stay right by my desk, just for today." The silence on the other end of the line had stretched like a taut wire. "Margaret," Mrs. Patterson had finally replied, her voice sharp as November frost, "this is a place of business, not a daycare center. Company policy is quite clear on this matter." But Margaret had few options. The bills wouldn't wait, and neither would the phones that needed answering or the clients who needed greeting. So she had made her choice. The kind of choice that mothers have been making since the beginning of time, weighing what must be done against what might happen. Tommy had been perfect, of course. He always was. At 8 years old, he possessed that rare combination of curiosity and courtesy that made adults smile despite themselves. He sat cross-legged on the small carpet beside Margaret's desk, his coloring book spread around him like a rainbow, his voice never rising above a whisper when he asked for a new crayon or a glass of water. The morning had passed peacefully. Clients smiled when they saw Tommy, and he would look up from his drawings with those bright blue eyes and offer a small wave. Mr. Henderson himself had stopped by the reception desk twice, once to compliment Tommy on his picture of a red barn, and once to ask Margaret if she needed anything from the supply closet. But at 11:30, Mrs. Patterson had arrived. Margaret could still remember the sound of those sharp heels clicking across the polished floor, could still see the way Mrs. Patterson's mouth had pressed into a thin line when she spotted Tommy carefully coloring within the lines of a cartoon dinosaur. "Margaret," the voice had been ice-cold. "Please see me in my office. Now." What followed was a conversation that lasted exactly 7 minutes. Margaret knew this because she had watched the clock on Mrs. Patterson's desk, its second hand sweeping around and around as her world shifted beneath her feet. "This is exactly the kind of unprofessional behavior that gives working mothers a bad reputation," Mrs. Patterson had said, her words crisp and cutting. "You've compromised the integrity of our workplace, and frankly, Margaret, I'm disappointed in your judgment." "Mrs. Patterson, please," Margaret had replied, her voice steady, despite the trembling in her hands. "Tommy wasn't bothering anyone. He's been perfectly well behaved, and the policy exists for a reason," Mrs. Patterson had interrupted. "What if all our employees decided to bring their children to work? What kind of message does this send? To our clients? I'm sorry, Margaret, but I have to let you go, effective immediately." And just like that, 4 years of dedication, of never missing a day, of staying late when needed and arriving early when asked, all of it meant nothing. Margaret had packed her few personal items in silence while Tommy waited in the hallway, still clutching his coloring book. She had explained to him, as they walked to the car, that sometimes grown-ups have to make changes, and this was one of those times. Tommy had nodded solemnly, the way children do when they sense that something important has shifted in their small world. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of job applications and interviews, of stretching groceries and watching pennies. Margaret's savings account, never robust to begin with, dwindled like autumn leaves falling from a tree. She applied for positions at law offices, medical practices, small businesses throughout the county. Each rejection felt like a small stone, added to the weight she carried in her chest. Then came the call from Riverside Medical Associates. Dr. Patricia Holloway had a warm voice, the kind that immediately put Margaret at ease. "We've reviewed your resume, Mrs. Davis, and we'd like to schedule an interview. Would Thursday at 2 o'clock work for you?" Margaret had arranged for her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, to watch Tommy after school. The medical practice was located in a converted Victorian house on the east side of town, its wraparound porch lined with flowering mums in shades of gold and burgundy. Margaret paused for a moment before entering, straightening her blazer and taking a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. The interview had gone well, better than well, actually. Dr. Holloway was in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. They talked about Margaret's experience, her organizational skills, her way with people. The salary was fair, the hours reasonable, and the work itself seemed meaningful. "I think you'd be a wonderful addition to our team," Dr. Holloway had said, as they concluded the interview. "When could you start?" Margaret had felt a flutter of hope in her chest, the first she'd experienced in weeks. "Right away, if needed. But I do have to be honest about something, Dr. Holloway." She had taken a breath, steadying herself for what might come next. "I'm a single mother, and while I'm completely committed to doing excellent work, sometimes unexpected things happen with children. I want to be upfront about that." Dr. Holloway had leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "I appreciate your honesty, Margaret, and I think any employer who doesn't understand that life happens, well, they're missing out on some exceptional employees." The job offer had come the next morning. Margaret's first day at Riverside Medical Associates was a Monday in early November. The practice was bustling but organized, with a steady stream of patients flowing through the comfortable waiting room. Dr. Holloway introduced her to the staff, 2 other doctors, 3 nurses, and a part-time bookkeeper who came in twice a week. Everyone was welcoming, but Margaret found herself particularly drawn to the youngest doctor on staff, Dr. James Mitchell. He was perhaps in his early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle manner with both patients and staff. There was something about him that reminded her of Tommy, a certain thoughtfulness, a way of listening that made you feel heard. Margaret settled into her new role with gratitude and determination. The work was engaging, the patients were generally pleasant, and Dr. Holloway proved to be everything she had seemed during the interview: fair, understanding, and genuinely invested in creating a positive workplace. 3 weeks into the job, on a grey Tuesday that felt heavy with the promise of winter, Margaret received the call that every working parent dreads. "Mrs. Davis, this is Principal Williams from Riverside Elementary. Tommy is in the nurse's office with a fever, and we need someone to pick him up right away." Margaret's heart sank. She glanced at the appointment schedule, packed solid with patients until 5 o'clock. She thought of Mrs. Patterson's sharp words, of the disappointment in Dr. Holloway's eyes if she had to leave work early again. But she also thought of Tommy, small and feverish, waiting for his mother to come. She approached Dr. Holloway's office, with careful steps, her explanation ready. Dr. Holloway listened thoughtfully, then nodded. "Of course you need to get Tommy," she said simply. "But Margaret, why don't you bring him back here? He can rest in the small office behind the reception desk, and you can keep an eye on him while you work." Margaret had felt her eyes fill with unexpected tears. "Are you sure? I don't want to cause any problem." "Nonsense," Dr. Holloway had replied with a wave of her hand. "Children get sick. It's what they do. We'll manage just fine." And so Tommy had spent the afternoon curled up on the small couch in the back office, a blanket tucked around him, sipping ginger ale and occasionally peeking out to wave at his mother. The other staff members checked on him throughout the day, bringing him crackers and asking about his favorite subjects in school. By evening, his fever had broken and his cheeks had regained their natural color. Margaret had thanked Dr. Holloway repeatedly, but the older woman had simply smiled and said, "This is what civilized workplaces do, Margaret. We take care of each other." It was the following week when everything came full circle. Margaret was processing insurance forms on a busy Thursday morning when she heard familiar voices in the hallway. Dr. Holloway was speaking with someone. Their conversation too low to make out the words, but something about the tone made Margaret look up from her computer screen. A moment later, Dr. Holloway appeared in the reception area, followed by a man in an expensive-looking suit. He was perhaps in his early 50s, with greying hair and a face that struck Margaret as vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. "Margaret," Dr. Holloway said with a smile, "I'd like you to meet Robert Patterson. He's considering joining our practice as a partner." The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. Patterson. Could it be? The man stepped forward, extending his hand with a polished smile. "Mrs. Davis, isn't it? Patricia has told me wonderful things about your work here." Margaret shook his hand, her mind racing. The resemblance was unmistakable now that she looked closely. The same sharp features, the same calculating eyes, though his manner was considerably warmer than his wife's had ever been. "Patterson," she said carefully. "Are you by any chance related to—" "Ah," he said with a slight grimace, "you've met my wife, Eleanor. She works over at Henderson Accounting." His expression grew more serious. "I hope you didn't have any difficulties there. Eleanor can be quite particular about office policies." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "Actually, Mr. Patterson, I used to work there until recently." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Robert Patterson's expression shifted, and Margaret saw something like recognition dawn in his eyes. "You're the woman who was fired for bringing your son to work," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded, her chin lifting slightly, despite her embarrassment. Yes, that was me. What happened next was something Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. Robert Patterson was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if he was looking at something far away. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, tinged with something that might have been regret. "Mrs. Davis," he said slowly, "I need to tell you something. When I was 8 years old, my mother was a single parent working as a secretary at a law firm downtown. There was a day, I'll never forget it, when I got sick at school and she had no choice but to bring me to work with her." Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. "I spent the afternoon in her office, coloring and reading, trying to be as quiet as a mouse because I knew how important her job was to us. Her boss, Mr. Hendricks, was a kind man. He brought me a sandwich from the deli across the street and told me I was welcome any time I needed to be there." Robert Patterson paused, his eyes meeting Margaret's directly. That kindness, that understanding, it meant everything to my mother and to me. It taught me something about the kind of person I wanted to be, the kind of workplace I wanted to create someday. Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Mrs. Davis," Robert continued, "I want you to know that what happened to you at Henderson Accounting, that's not who I am, that's not what I believe in, and I'm deeply sorry that you experienced that kind of treatment." Dr. Holloway, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. "Robert, I think you should know that Margaret is one of the finest employees we've ever had, and when her son needed to be here with her last week, he was an absolute delight. Children aren't problems to be managed. They're human beings who sometimes need their parents." Robert Patterson nodded slowly. Dr. Holloway, if you'll have me as a partner, I'd like to help you create the kind of practice where families are valued, where employees are treated with dignity and understanding. He turned back to Margaret. And, Mrs. Davis, I hope you'll give me the chance to show you that not all members of the Patterson family share the same perspective on what makes a workplace successful. Margaret wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. Mr. Patterson, I don't know what to say. Say you'll stay, Dr. Holloway interjected with a gentle smile. Say you'll help us build something special here. And so Margaret did stay. Robert Patterson did join the practice, and true to his word, he helped create an environment where families were genuinely valued. There was a small playroom set up in the back office, stocked with books and toys for the occasional child who needed to accompany a parent to work. There was a policy of flexible scheduling for parents, and an understanding that life's unexpected moments weren't obstacles to overcome, but simply part of the human experience. Tommy, now 9 and in 4th grade, occasionally stopped by after school to do his homework in the back office. He became something of a mascot for the practice, charming patients with his polite manners and bright curiosity. Dr. Mitchell, in particular, took a shine to him, often explaining simple medical concepts that left Tommy wide-eyed with wonder. One evening, as Margaret was preparing to leave work, she found Robert Patterson in the hallway, looking at a small framed picture Tommy had drawn for the office. It showed the medical practice with all the staff members standing in front, their faces rendered in the enthusiastic, imperfect way of childhood art. "You know," Robert said without looking up from the drawing, "my mother kept a picture I drew of her office when I was about Tommy's age. She said it reminded her that work wasn't just about the job, it was about the life we were building together." Margaret joined him in studying Tommy's artwork. "I never thanked that boss of your mother's," she said softly. "Mr. Hendricks, was it? I wish I could tell him how much his kindness meant. Not just to your mother, but to the man you became because of it." Robert smiled. "I think he knew. Kindness has a way of rippling forward, doesn't it? We never know whose life we might be touching, or how that touch might change the world in small but important ways." As Margaret drove home that evening, Tommy chattering happily in the back seat about his day at school, she reflected on the strange and wonderful way life could circle back on itself. How a moment of kindness from decades ago could bloom into understanding and compassion years later. How being fired for bringing her son to work had led her to a place where bringing her son to work was seen not as a problem, but as part of the beautiful, complicated tapestry of human life. She thought about the seed she had mentioned to Tommy once. How kindness, like a seed, never knew where it might take root. Sometimes it took years to bloom. Sometimes it bloomed in the most unexpected places, in the hearts of people we never knew we had touched. And sometimes, if we were very lucky, we got to see that bloom with our own eyes, and know that in the great garden of human experience we had played a small part in making something beautiful grow. That night, as she tucked Tommy into bed, he looked up at her with those bright blue eyes and said, "Mom, I like your new job. Everyone there is really nice." "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret replied, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "They really are." And in the quiet of that moment, surrounded by the gentle sounds of their small home, Margaret Davis knew that sometimes the best things in life come not from the smooth, easy paths, but from the rocky ones that teach us to appreciate kindness when we find it, and to pass it along whenever we can. The seeds we plant with our compassion, she had learned, have a way of growing into gardens we never imagined possible.